Picture this. You're the most powerful man in the world. You've conquered nations, command armies, and have temples built in your honor. And your biggest concern today is whether your horse prefers marble or granite in its private palace. Welcome to Rome, where emperors were gods, laws were optional, and personal boundaries didn't exist. These weren't just rulers, they were bored billionaires with armies, daddy issues, and zero impulse control. And when you combine absolute power with no accountability, you don't get stability. You get orgies during Senate meetings, torture as entertainment, and wedding vows to castrated slaves. Today, we dive into the 5 most perverted emperors in Roman history, men so unhinged they made Caligula look like a disappointed dad at a PTA meeting. So, if you thought the Colosseum was for lions and gladiators, let's just say that was the family-friendly part of the empire. Let's start with the teenage emperor who turned his palace into a brothel and worked there himself. Most 14-year-olds rebel by getting a piercing or dyeing their hair. Elgabilus became emperor of Rome and immediately decided that traditional imperial behavior was optional. This Syrian teenager took power in 218 and threw parties that would make modern billionaires uncomfortable. We're talking elaborate gatherings in the throne room, with senators forced to participate in activities that had nothing to do with governing an empire. But Elgabilus didn't just host these events, he participated in ways that scandalized Roman society. The emperor would dress in elaborate costumes and take on roles that completely contradicted everything Romans expected from their ruler. Imagine trying to explain that career choice to your political advisors. The most shocking part? Elgabilus actively sought out medical procedures to alter his appearance and identity. In ancient Rome, where traditional masculine leadership was the foundation of society, this was revolutionary in the worst possible way. When no physician was brave enough to perform such procedures on the emperor, he entered into ceremonial unions that defied every social convention. This wasn't just teenage experimentation, it was political dynamite. Romans could tolerate corruption, murder, even the occasional family massacre. But watching their emperor challenge fundamental social structures while running the empire, that shattered every cultural norm they had. The Praetorian Guard ended his reign when he was 18, after just 4 years of rule. Even in Rome, there were boundaries you didn't cross, though apparently it took them 4 years to figure out where those boundaries were. So Elgabilus shocked Rome by transforming palace protocol and challenging social conventions. But at least he kept the worst of it relatively private. Our next emperor took his unconventional behavior public and declared himself a god while doing it. Meet Caligula, the man who turned state dinners into horror shows. Caligula started as Rome's golden boy, young, handsome, charming, everything you'd want in an heir to the empire. Then something snapped, and Rome learned what happens when a complete psychopath gets divine authority. First, Caligula declared himself a living god, not metaphorically, literally. He built temples to himself, demanded worship from senators, and had conversations with statues of Jupiter like they were old drinking buddies. When people didn't take his divinity seriously enough, he executed them for blasphemy, against himself. But the god complex was just the warm-up act. Caligula's relationships with his 3 sisters became the scandal of the empire. According to historian Suetonius, he treated them in ways that violated every social boundary at public events, in front of their husbands, in front of everyone. This wasn't palace gossip, it was imperial policy. The dinner parties became legendary for all the wrong reasons. Caligula would invite Rome's elite for what seemed like normal state dinners, then halfway through the meal begin inflicting extreme punishment on random guests for entertainment. Not political prisoners, just people who bored him. Picture trying to enjoy your wine while the senator next to you faces brutal consequences because he didn't laugh hard enough at the emperor's jokes. And then there's the horse. Caligula made his favorite stallion, Incitatus, a consul, one of Rome's highest political offices. The horse had a marble stable, purple blankets,
and a collar of precious stones. It also had more actual political influence than most human senators. Let that sink in for a moment. The terrifying part? This wasn't madness. It was methodology. Every absurd, cruel act was designed to demonstrate that Caligula could do anything, to anyone, at any time, and nobody could stop him. When you can make a horse a politician and force people to worship you as a god, you've achieved the ultimate power trip. The Praetorian Guard finally had enough and ended his reign in an underground corridor. Turns out even Rome's most elite soldiers have breaking points. So Caligula used terror and absurdity to prove his godhood, but at least he understood it was about power and control. Our next emperor actually believed his own fantasy, and that's when delusion becomes truly dangerous. Meet Commodus, the man who genuinely thought he was Hercules and turned the entire empire into his personal superhero movie.
Most emperors wanted to be remembered as great rulers or brilliant military commanders. Commodus wanted to be remembered as Hercules. And he wasn't speaking metaphorically. This guy genuinely believed he was the reincarnation of the Greek hero. He dressed like Hercules, carried a club to Senate meetings, and commissioned hundreds of statues showing himself with a lion skin headdress. Senators had to sit through government sessions where their emperor wore a lion costume and referred to himself in the third person as a demigod. But Commodus didn't just play dress-up in the palace. He took his superhero fantasy to the Colosseum. The Emperor of Rome regularly participated in gladiatorial contests against disadvantaged opponents, with advantages that made victory inevitable, while the crowd was forced to cheer like he was the greatest warrior in history. 620 times. That's how often Commodus fought in the arena. He never lost a single match, because losing meant consequences no one was prepared to face. So Rome's elite sat in the stands, watching their ruler defeat opponents who had no real chance, while pretending it was the most impressive athletic display they'd ever witnessed. Meanwhile, he was literally auctioning off the empire. Government positions went to the highest bidder. Military commands were sold like property. He once sold the consulship so many times in a single year that nobody knew who was actually running the government. Rome became a bizarre combination of marketplace and fantasy theater. The perversion wasn't about personal desires. It was psychological. Commodus turned an entire empire into his personal role-playing game, where everyone had to pretend his delusions were reality. The rich and powerful had to applaud while he dismantled everything their ancestors had built just to feed his superhero complex. When he finally announced he was permanently moving into the gladiator barracks to live full-time as a fighter, his own advisors ended his reign. Even in Rome, there's a limit to how much fantasy people will tolerate before reality intervenes. Commodus lived in a delusional fantasy where he was the hero of his own adventure story. But fantasies can be harmless, even if they're completely detached from reality. What's truly chilling is when an emperor turns reality into his personal theater of cruelty, where real people become disposable entertainment. Enter Nero, the artist who created masterpieces from other people's suffering. Nero wanted to be remembered as Rome's greatest artist. Instead, he became its most theatrical monster. And honestly, the line between those two things turned out to be disturbingly thin. It started with eliminating his mother, which sounds terrible until you remember we're talking about Nero, so this was basically his warm-up routine. He had Agrippina removed from the picture, but not quickly or quietly. First, he tried poison. She survived because she'd built up immunity. Then he rigged her bedroom ceiling to collapse.
She escaped through the debris. Finally, he sent soldiers to finish the job while she reportedly shouted, "Strike the womb that bore Nero." Even by Roman family standards, this was intense. But removing his mother was just the opening act. Nero's wife Poppaea died under suspicious circumstances, officially during a pregnancy complication after a violent argument. Most historians consider it deliberate elimination. Nero called it inspiration for his next tragic play. Because that's what made Nero truly disturbing. He turned real suffering into performance art. After Poppaea's death, he found a young man named Sporus who resembled his deceased wife. He had Sporus undergo procedures to alter his appearance, dressed him in women's clothes, and married him in a full imperial ceremony. Then he made Sporus perform the dead wife's roles in his theatrical productions. Imagine being forced to watch your emperor's twisted grief therapy performed by someone who'd been transformed against their will. The performances were mandatory, by the way. When Nero sang or acted, Romans had to attend and show enthusiasm for hours. Women gave birth during his concerts rather than miss them and face consequences. People faked illnesses to escape his poetry readings. This wasn't entertainment, it was psychological control with a soundtrack. The Great Fire of Rome? Nero probably didn't start it, but he definitely used it as creative inspiration. While the city burned and people lost everything, he stood on his palace roof composing epic songs about the destruction of Troy. Art imitating life, or life imitating art. With Nero, the distinction had completely disappeared. When the Senate finally declared him a public enemy and he faced certain doom, Nero's last words were reportedly, "What an artist perishes in me." Even facing death, he was still performing, still thinking about his artistic legacy. The ultimate method actor, committed to his craft right until the final curtain. Nero was a monster, but he was a public monster, performing his cruelty like theater for everyone to witness. But the most dangerous predators aren't the ones who make a spectacle of their evil. They're the quiet ones who disappear to private locations where no one can observe what happens. Meet Tiberius, the competent emperor who built his own private world of absolute control. If you want to understand true corruption of power, don't look at the flashy psychopaths who crave attention. Look at the quiet, competent ones who disappeared to remote locations and build private worlds where absolutely nothing is off limits. Tiberius started as Rome's most effective emperor, military genius, brilliant administrator, exactly what the empire needed after Augustus died. Then he moved to the island of Capri and transformed into something that would horrify modern observers. Villa Jovis wasn't just a palace, it was a purpose-built facility designed for every form of personal indulgence and control the human mind could conceive. According to historian Tacitus, Tiberius filled the compound with young attendants trained to fulfill every possible role in his private world. We're talking about spaces designed specifically for activities that Roman writers, who weren't exactly modest in their descriptions, couldn't even detail in their historical accounts. The elaborate pools became legendary throughout the empire. Picture this: stunning Mediterranean settings, beautiful natural surroundings, and young people trained to provide whatever services the emperor demanded during his private time. Suetonius referred to some of these attendants using terms that suggest their roles were both specific and disturbing. But Tiberius didn't just control people. He collected their suffering like other emperors collected art. Visitors to Capri described elaborate chambers where the emperor would observe people facing extreme consequences while he enjoyed his meals. Not for political reasons, not to extract information, just because he found their distress entertaining. The cliff became his signature method of disposal. When Tiberius grew tired of someone or when they'd served their purpose, he'd have them thrown off the 600-foot drop into the Mediterranean rocks below. Guards waited at the bottom to ensure no one survived the fall. It became so routine that locals developed their own terminology for it.
What made it truly disturbing was the isolation. On Capri, Tiberius could indulge every impulse without any consequences whatsoever. No senators to consider, no public image to maintain, no limits of any kind, just unlimited imperial power in a place where what happened stayed completely private. For 11 years, the Roman Empire was effectively ruled by a man who'd retreated into his own private domain and used it to exercise absolute control over anyone within his reach. When he finally died, under circumstances that suggest his own staff had reached their limit, Romans literally celebrated in the streets.
So, what's the lesson here? These weren't just 5 random psychopaths, they were the inevitable result of giving human beings unlimited power with zero consequences. When there are no limits on what you can do, power doesn't just corrupt, it turns you into a monster. The scariest part? Romans tolerated most of this for years. Murder, torture, insanity, all perfectly fine as long as the bread kept coming and the borders stayed secure. In a world without boundaries, depravity becomes policy. Human beings become props in the fantasies of madmen with armies. And apparently, that's the price of empire.